doing a wellness check on the teenagers in high school right now because what is this? Someone sent their AP government textbook to Carol Markowitz, their cousin, to show them the political ideology grid that they are currently teaching in American high schools. Guys, I have so many questions. Apparently the only person in American politics who is economic right and more libertarian is Ron Paul, who is like barely libertarian. Hillary Clinton and George W. Bush are the same dot because they have the same exact political ideology.
So by the way, you can see this is economic right, economic left, authoritarian, and libertarian down here.
I like how Donald Trump is more authoritarian than Stalin.
Well, we're going to get to that. Yes, you can see exactly where Trump, Ted Cruz, and right next to Hitler. And by the way, Margaret Thatcher.
What? And they both are more authoritarian than Fidel Castro. Apparently, Obama is a right-wing authoritarian in 2008, and he becomes more right-wing economically and more authoritarian by 2012, closely mirroring the political ideology of Maggie Thatcher. And of course, Ted Cruz, who is far more authoritarian, by the way, than Fidel Castro. And pretty much on the exact same line. It looks like he's more authoritarian than Joseph Stalin over there. Donald Trump is on par, of course, with Hitler. Bernie Sanders is barely economic left. Nelson Mandela is a libertarian. What? I don't even know what to do with this. The textbook in question, your college level American government course, your AP course offered to high schoolers in America today. And justice for George W. Bush having to share a dot with Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite demonstrative of what's going on right now, because the funny part is all of them are extremes. We have no center anymore. And the closest we come to the center is Bernie Sanders.
Of course we do.
We have this person says, as per usual, you're a gullible piece of shit who loves boosting misleading garbage. And they included this right here. Says the graphic shows where the political compass ideology quiz places figures from recent U.S. Presidential campaigns and several famous political figures from outside the United States. Do you agree with it? So it's asking, do you agree? Right. But they're very clear. I mean, that's fairly subjective. Do you agree? Because when I guarantee you could get a teacher in Seattle who would put Donald Trump off this chart up here, like way off the chart, and you'd have a teacher in Florida who would put Donald Trump down here, right? So that also is fairly subjective based off of your political leanings. So,
and also, what kind of question is, do you agree? No. Okay. Refuses to elaborate further. Leaves.
You know what this makes me wonder? So, has anyone here done AP courses before? Well, Archie wouldn't be able to.
Been a long ass time.
We don't have those over here.
So in AP, there are some essays at the very end of those exams that you have to answer, and I'm wondering if it's possible to be like, I don't agree with this chart as like a question, right? Like a theoretical question or whatever. If someone's grading it and they're totally left wing and then they end up failing that kid because they don't agree with that opinion or anything that they're saying, that's fucked.
I agree.
Unless it's like straight up just historical questions, like in 1776, what happened? Right? And it's blah, 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 blah. But if it's like an actual, like, oh, what do you think of this? And they're just basing it on how you present your logic and whatever, and they just don't like what you're saying, fail. That's rough.
I have my daughter is in 8th grade. She's going to go into high school, right? And she is in AP classes, smart kid. And she is being taught about, she's actually doing a giant project about the Civil War right now and slavery and everything that went along into that, right? And we were having a conversation about this, and she goes, do you think that slavery started in the United States? And I very quickly, and once again, she's 13, 14 years old, right? And I'm like, no, sweet child. This has been around forever, and I had to like teach her about this, right? And I'm glad we actually had that conversation, because nowhere are they being taught that, like, they're being taught that this is like the original sin of the United States. Not that this has been going on since the beginning of mankind, and by the way, is still going on, right now in society, on Earth. And she was very not shocked, but it was exciting to see that she was receptive to the knowledge that this was actually happening, and it really kind of shifted her perspective on the whole thing. But if you're asking a 16 or 17-year-old kid who's being told, their entire society is bad, there are pressures when you're asked, how do you think about something like this, especially coming from a place of authority? Your job in a subjective type prompt like that, how do you feel about this? There are pressures when it comes to wanting to appease the teacher and write around the teacher based off of their thoughts, and they will certainly let you know their thoughts.
Well, it makes it a socio-normative question rather than a logical or philosophical question. And that's kind of the problem. Because, if you want to go even spicier, you can point out that, no, slavery was at once upon a time a humanitarian step forward. As before we figured out how large-scale slavery worked, we just killed everybody. You conquered a village, you just killed them all. Literally.
What's interesting is there was the idea of, and I don't want to get into like the conversation of slavery or whatever, but there was interesting, I was watching a video by a content creator called Elephant in the Room. Have you guys heard of this guy before? Elephant in the Room? He touches on these really touchy subjects, like obviously the elephant in the room, right? And he does a very data-driven 20-minute, more or less, video essay on these things. What happened during COVID? What was the story of whatever, right? Things that 3, 4, 5 years ago you would have been shunned on YouTube for talking about. And it's a really interesting take. And one of the things he talked about with slavery in particular was how Western and specifically European countries found that slavery was actually more expensive by keeping them slaves as opposed to just paying them, right? Because they had to house them, they had to feed them, they had to maintain, and regardless of their output, that cost is still happening in real time, as opposed to more or less trading their time for money. So that was actually something that is not discussed enough. And I'm not saying that's the only cause. That's not what he was saying either. But it was a contributing factor to it kind of winding down. And he saw that countries that actually had specifically like parts the South versus the North during the Civil War, the South actually lagged behind in industry because they were so tied to agriculture, and that was. It was actually holding them back because they were so tied to that. And then the cotton gin was created. It was a fascinating video. And I'm not saying everything that he said in it was accurate or wrong, but it just definitely gives you a different perspective on things that is not taught in history books, specifically, I know, in the United States at all. So it's
this is why I highly recommend everybody read up on Grant, the U.S. president, Ulysses S. Grant, because he goes into extensive detail on, what was it? Not Reconstruction, reconciliation with the southern states, and the economic problems that occurred after the liberation of the slaves. One of which was that in many cases, slave families were worse off after liberation because there was no political will nor political capital to fulfill the promises of 40 acres and a mule. And so you had entire dispossessed populations who now didn't have an income. They didn't have work. They didn't have shelter. They didn't have food. They didn't have any of these guarantees. They were liberated and then thrown out into the wilderness, which led to most of them returning to the very plantations they used to work on, but now being paid less and getting less in return for their labor than they received as slaves. As the entire system was very poorly thought through. It was one of the first virtue signals, in essence, of let's liberate the slaves. Okay, what happens next? I don't know. They'll be fine, I guess.
Right. What's the plan after this? Right.
And there was no plan. I mean, hell, the original plan from Abraham Lincoln was to round them all up and ship them back to Africa. That was the actual plan. But yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Like the U.S. education system is obviously very slanted. I think we all understand that, and it's something that I think we're all extremely mindful. If it was up to me, and this is a larger conversation, I would have my kids out of public education. I wish I could, but this is a team conversation, and it's not a conversation. So, anyways, the best thing we can do is educate on top of the education that they're getting. So, it's a tough conversation, if you will, in the household.